Chapter 12. Afterward. Though they burned Joan's body to ashes, they couldn't wipe out her memory. The idea that she was a witch flourished for a long time in England. Even Shakespeare called her a foul fiend. But the idea that she was a saint grew and grew among the French people. Stories flew around that Joan's heart had remained intact despite the intense fire, and that, as her soul left her body, a dove flew out of the smoke. After the trial, the English dispatched letters in the name of King Henry VI to all princes of Western Christendom, stating that Joan had been put to death for the benefit of the faith and to wipe out heresy. The University of Paris alerted the Pope and the College of Cardinals to the excellent work of Bishop Cauchon in bringing to trial and condemning to death a certain woman dressed as a man who had sinned against the Orthodox faith and falsely claimed to be sent by God. The Duke of Bedford, hoping to annul the effect of Charles's coronation, arranged to have little Henry, already King of England, crowned King of France too. But the city of Reims refused to crown him, and the English had to settle for a Paris coronation. The celebration turned out with a gala procession to the Cathedral of Notre Dame. As the royal cortege passed the home of the old Queen Isabella, young Henry saluted her. The doddering old queen waved back to her half-French, half-English grandson, son of her daughter and Henry V, whose marriage she and the Duke of Burgundy had arranged. She turned away in tears. One wonders what her emotions were. The palace feast held the next day, a Sunday, was a fiasco. According to the French, the English bungled everything in what should have been an impressive ceremony. For one thing, the food was shocking. Unpardonable to the French, it had been cooked the Thursday before, and King Henry failed to bestow the expected benefits on the citizens: release of prisoners, reprieve of taxes, and gifts to the poor. The common people complained of the stinginess of the English. The whole affair was a flop. No one had a good word to say about it. No one was fooled by the coronation either. The French people knew Henry could not be a proper French king without being crowned and anointed with holy oil in the Cathedral of Reims. Then the Duke of Bedford received the worst possible setback to his schemes of English occupation. His partner, Duke Philip, noting that Charles's popularity was steadily rising, began to realize that he was French after all. In 1435, he concluded a treaty, not just a truce, with his cousin Charles, recognizing him as King of France. Charles's slow diplomacy was beginning to show results, but not without concessions. He had to give the Duke a political payback, allowing him to keep for himself many of the French lands he had captured with the aid of the English. The Duke remained as rich and powerful as ever, but at least his ties with England had been severed. Later that year, the Duke of Bedford died, and soon after, Paris opened its gates to Charles. The city was in shambles, suffering from the war, disrupted communications, and lack of leadership. Its neglected poor were dying off as famine stalked the city. At night, wolves again swam across the Seine River to prowl the city streets in search of corpses. But now the people took new hope at the sight of a real French king, who graciously pardoned them all for having supported the enemy. The fickle mob embraced the royalists as eagerly as they had the Burgundians and the English not so long before. Slowly but surely, Charles regained power and prestige. One evil influence on the king had been removed. His fat friend, Trimoil, had fallen from power. Stabbed in the stomach in an assassination attempt, Trimoil's life was saved only by his excessive flesh. He left the royal court never to return. Constable Richemont replaced him and began to step up military action against the English. Relying on the new class of rich merchants for funds, Charles built up a royal professional army with greatly improved artillery. Culverins and cannon were now effective in besieging cities. Town walls began to fall at the onslaught of French bombardments. Inspired by the memory of Joan's impetuous attacks, the French no longer waited for the English to set up barricades, but took the offensive and often caught the enemy off guard or on the march. Imbued with a rising patriotic spirit, the French recaptured one by one the lands they had lost. Without Burgundy's support, the English were unable to withstand the new French vigor. Enthusiasm for their overseas war began to wane. Finally, in 1453, 22 years after Joan's death, the English were forced to leave France forever. The foreign occupation was over, and as Joan had predicted, the English went home where they belonged. Only one town, Calais, remained in English hands, another concession to Duke Philip, who wanted a base for his wool trade with England. Shortly before this, when the town of Rouen had opened its gates to the French, the record of Joan's trial fell into Charles's hands. Almost immediately, the king appointed someone to look into the proceedings to find out on just what grounds Joan had been put to such a cruel death. With the English in retreat, Charles now felt secure enough to initiate an investigation into the trial that had condemned the maid who had given him his crown. His counselors urged him to find a way to wipe out the iniquitous, scandalous sentence that cast an undesirable stigma on the king's own character. His kingship and his prestige demanded that he clear Joan in order to clear himself of any taint of heresy. Though politics and self-interest were Charles's main concern, he now showed more courage and energy than he ever had before, for he knew that any re-examination of the case would open up old animosities and might cause a clash with the church. Now began a long, drawn-out investigation of Joan's trial. Lasting almost 7 years due to interruptions and political problems, this protracted inquiry came to be known as the Trial of Rehabilitation. First, a few of the churchmen who had participated in the first trial were still living in Rouen and were questioned. Bishop Cauchon and the prosecutor d'Esteve, Joan's implacable enemies, had died. The latter was found drowned in an open sewer, a fitting punishment, some thought, for his harsh conduct in the trial. All but one of these doctors agreed that the trial had been political, designed to prove Charles had been illegally crowned by the aid of a heretic and a sorceress. Most agreed that Joan had been unfairly judged, more from fear and hate than evidence of wrongdoing. They pointed out all the irregularities of Cauchon's beautiful trial, all the ways he and the English had attempted to intimidate any who dared disagree. Still, Joan couldn't be cleared of her so-called crime of heresy except through the church, which had condemned her. It was a ticklish situation for the church to have its own members called to testify. But now that Charles was back in power, the church needed his support. Luckily, a new pope, eager to help settle several disputes with France, agreed to look into Joan's trial. The second stage of the investigation concluded that Joan has always been a devout Catholic and that her judges had given in to English pressure to have her condemned. The trial record was shown to have been falsified in a few spots when it was translated from the daily minutes taken down in French to the Latin of the official document. Worse, the recantation Joan had signed was not the same as the one put in the official record. A longer, more incriminating one had been substituted. Though this church inquiry found Joan innocent, no public vindication of Joan was yet made. Not until 1455 did the final stage of the lengthy investigation take place. A more dramatic step brought Joan's own family into the limelight. Her mother, now in her 80s, appeared in Paris to petition for a rehabilitation of her daughter. With permission from the Pope, she and Joan's brothers were taken to the Cathedral of Notre Dame. Joan's father had already died, it was said, of a broken heart. Crowds of people were on hand and greatly moved as the old peasant woman, in tears, walked down the nave of the cathedral. Kneeling, she begged to have her daughter's honor restored and to redress the cruel injustice done to her. "I had a daughter," she said, "born in lawful marriage." She had brought Joan up in the fear of God and respect for the church. And though her daughter had never done anything contrary to the faith, certain enemies had brought her to trial and had condemned her in a damnable and wicked way, and put her to death most cruelly by fire. The thoroughness of the attempt to reverse the sentence against Joan seemed never ending. Inquiries were made in Domremy, in Vaucouleurs, in Orleans, every place where people had known Joan. All kinds of people, from plowman and local bell ringer to noble and priest, were interviewed. Childhood friends and relatives in Domremy testified to Joan's good character and piety. Alencon, Count Dunois, the bastard, her squire, and other fighting companions were eager to speak on Joan's behalf. Ignoring any of her failures, they emphasized only her glorious victories. Many of her former judges, who now showed up to testify, were evasive and conveniently failed to remember details about the trial. But in general, even they agreed that it had been unfair, based on the English terror and hatred of the girl who had changed the course of their war. Most of the judges now felt free to criticize and reveal the intimidation to which Cauchon and the English had subjected them. Of course, it was easy to blame Cauchon now that he was dead, easy to blame the English now that they had left France. Since most of the church doctors had gone along with Cauchon's verdict, they should have shared the blame. But, in a kind of cover-up, they put the blame mostly on the English and the procedure of the trial itself. Joan's mother had hoped that her daughter's judges would at least be cited for their infamous part in condemning Joan, but they were scot-free. Politics were as much part of this trial as the first one. The judges were not completely sincere, now wanting to please their King Charles, as they had formerly wanted to please the English. One exception was the University of Paris doctor Beaupierre, who refused to change his former opinion and remained skeptical about Joan's revelations. He thought they were more from human intention than supernatural, and that she was very subtle with a woman's subtlety. Beaupierre was one of the many medieval churchmen who thought women were the source of all evil. Whatever the politics, the results of this rehabilitation trial were clear. In 1456, the trial condemning Joan was pronounced null and void because of fraud and errors. Joan was cleared of heresy. Charles could rest assured that he had no taint of guilt by association with a heretic. The verdict of this retrial was read aloud to crowds of people in the old market of Rouen, at the very spot where Joan had been burned. One copy of the original trial record was publicly and dramatically torn up. But no mention was made of that difficult problem, Joan's claim to visions, nor of her achievements. The Church still reserved the right to examine visionaries and to pronounce whether they were true or false. It is unlikely that Joan would have accepted anyone's judgment on her voices except her own. She was so convinced of their reality that they became the very meaning of her life. Joan had clashed more with church authorities than with the church itself. She wholeheartedly believed in the church, but in her own way. She did not agree when men who judged her said that only they could decide the truth. She had her own inner truth. Her religion, uncluttered by the rigid rules and scholastic jargon of her judges, was simple and direct. And many of the doctors who have inwardly realized that she was a true believer in the faith, her deep sincerity was obvious. With her name cleared and her sentence revoked, the cult of Joan as heroine and saint grew and grew among the people. She became a folk heroine who had saved the kingdom of France, but almost 500 years went by before the church and state recognized her as a saint. In 1920, she was canonized for her virtuous life and her faith in God. There was no mention of her heroism, her visions, or her courage. Joan was spared, knowing the strange fate of her beloved saints Margaret and Catherine, who have been removed from the church calendar because of doubts that they ever existed. But even such a delusionment would not have destroyed her faith in her revelations and her mission. The French writer and statesman André Malraux has best expressed how people who never ceased to love and admire her felt. Quote, O Joan, sans sepulchre a sans portrait, toi qui savas que les tombeaux des héros est le cœur des vivants. which can be freely translated as, "O Joan, without any grave or portrait to remember you by, you who knew that the true monument for heroes is in the hearts of the living." End quote.